Get ready to hear some timeless historical radio broadcasts. Thank you for visiting Golden Age Radio. Listen to the complete NBC and CBS D-Day broadcasts on rebel.com/C/GAR. Support our veterans by visiting veteransradioministry.com. Let's honor their sacrifice. Thank you.
In a few seconds, we will take you to London for the first eyewitness account of the actual invasion of France by sea, of the landing of Allied troops on a French beachhead. War correspondent George Hicks saw those landings from the bridge of an Allied warship, and through the ingenuity of radio wire recording, the National Broadcasting Company is able to give you the story as witnessed by George Hicks in a pool broadcast. So, now NBC takes you to London for the first eyewitness account of the actual invasion of Europe. Go ahead, NBC in London.
I'm in the crowd.
Ladies and gentlemen, we had hoped at this time to bring you an account of the actual invasion of France by sea, of the landing of Allied troops on a French beachhead. We take you to London.
Screen over the sky, but which is not thick nor heavy, and not low enough to be an inconvenience to bombing. The LCTs and the LCIs have begun to pass along the side of us. Those are the amphibious beach landing craft that carry the tanks, trucks, bulldozers, and finally the men ashore. They've been churning along and are bouncing around in the choppy Channel Sea now. And all around us, on either side, are stretched the fast transports at anchor who have disembarked these small craft. They, all over the surface of the sea here, can be seen cutting and zigzagging and then forming into those somewhat irregular lines.
Ladies and gentlemen, apparently atmospherics have again interfered with our rebroadcast of an account of the invasion by George Hicks from London. We again take you to London.
In out of the United States.
Hello, New York. Didn't you get that? The National Broadcasting Company takes you now to Chicago.
From Chicago, the National Broadcasting Company presents music by Roy Shield and the orchestra and featuring Gene McKenna and Richard Page. This program will be interrupted from time to time to bring you the latest news bulletins as they are received in the newsroom. Keep tuned to your favorite NBC station to keep in step with all the latest developments on this Invasion Day. And now Roy Shield and the orchestra open the program with a revival of an old hit, Blue Room.
and gentlemen, we interrupt this program to bring you a special broadcast from London.
This is George Hicks speaking. I'm speaking now from the tower above the signal
We
bridge
take you now to George Hicks
of
in
an
London.
American naval flagship, and we're lying some few miles off the coast of France where the invasion of Europe has begun. It's now 20 minutes to 6, and the landing craft have been disembarked from their motherships and moving in long, irregular lines toward the horizon of France, which is very plain to the naked eye. Our own bombardment fleet, lying out beyond us, has begun to blast the shoreline, and we can see the vivid yellow bursts of flame quite clearly, although the sound is too far away to be heard, and at the same time, from the shore, are answering yellow flames as the Nazi batteries are replying. Overhead, planes are high up in the thin cloud, which is a gray screen over the sky, but which is not thick nor heavy, and not low enough to be an inconvenience to bombing. The LCTs and LCIs have begun to pass along the side of us. Those are the amphibious beach landing craft that carry the tanks, trucks, bulldozers, and finally the men ashore. They've been churning along and are bouncing around in the choppy Channel Sea now. And all around us, on either side, are stretched the fast transports at anchor who have disembarked these small craft. And they, all over the surface of the sea here, can be seen cutting and zigzagging and then forming into those somewhat irregular lines that make a black pencil point across the sea itself, heading toward the ribbon of land that's France and the coast of Normandy. We can see the wreaths of smoke that are beginning to puff up, both black and white, on the shoreline. France, at this particular part of its northwestern sea coast, has a rather shallow beach and then steep cliffs, 100 to 200 feet, and then the rolling land beyond. This area is between Cherbourg and Le Havre. The wind has increased rather than diminished during the night and is now blowing an 18-knot wind, which is pretty stiff and kicking up white caps. However, the landing beach craft are going in and are plowing through the choppy sea and seem to be making good headway. The order of the attack is for a naval bombardment, an air bombardment, then landing craft going in carrying tanks, then a wave of infantry to take the first toehold on the beaches, and then a wave of the beach demolition engineers who will knock out with hand charges the underwater obstacles and those on the shore itself. It's now becoming quite clear and daylight as 6 a.m. approaches on June 6, 1944. Occasionally, in the stiff wind that's whipping around our platform, we can hear the thud of shells or bombs landing on the French coastline, perhaps 8 or 10 miles before us. And the steel plates on which we stand vibrate from the concussion of the heavy guns that are firing from the American and British battleships and heavy cruisers forming a long line right behind us. I can count 22 of the squat, square-nosed landing craft carrying vehicles on one side of us as they turn and bounce in the choppy sea, waiting the exact timing to form their lines and start in towards the beach. When I had first begun speaking to you, it was the shore batteries of the Nazis that had spotted us here at sea and opened up, and our naval bombardment squad broadside to them. One battleship is in as close as 3 miles. And one of the famous American battleships is out 6 miles in her firing position. A duel is in progress now between a battleship lying just a couple of miles off the French shore and firing broadside into the land. The Germans are replying from the land with flashes, and then the ship lets go with its entire broadside again. The side of the battle wagon lights up with a yellow glare as the broadside goes off, and now you can see brown gray smoke drifting up from her gun barrels. Huge mushrooms of black and gray smoke are beginning to pile up off the beachhead of France. Directly before us, probably air bombardment, as the 2 columns are beginning to rise higher than the hills behind them. And to the left is another single column. It's just burst then on the top of the cliff above the chalk wall facing the sea, and puffs of smoke are standing up now like plumes. A fire has been started on the beach front directly before us, and now batteries are firing from the beach, flashes of yellow, and the broadsides of the battleships are pouring it back at them. Overhead, high, planes are roaring. I think they just came in and dropped a salvo of bombs that stick on that the hilltop directly before us that we spoke of a moment ago. A small flight of flying fortresses are passing over the invasion fleet. Bats can hear the roaring of their motors. 36, 38 flames against the wind that's rushing through the rigging of this mast top. Heavy bombardment, naval guns, ships seem to be even closer to the French shore now, hugging in along the coastline and blasting out their blossoms of yellow fire. There have been replies from the shore, but low, gray-pink clouds have set down over the coast of France. For a moment now, we're unable to see the outline of the land. Although over into the east, the sky has opened up. The loudspeaker on this flagship has been announcing almost continuously. The Spitfires on our starboard bow. P-38 dead ahead. The air support. Here comes 4 P-38s now, following the forts. The air has simply been crisscrossed with Allied planes of all types. The tank carrying and vehicle carrying landing craft have passed our ship and are beginning to form their line, which is already pointed toward the French coast. The earlier and smaller LCVTs, which carry infantry and personnel, have been en route now over 40 minutes, and according to the time schedule, should be hitting the French shore in 10 minutes from now. Everywhere you look in this jangled English channel, which is green and gold.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was an eyewitness account of the actual invasion of France by sea, of the landing of Allied troops on a French beachhead. War correspondent George Hicks saw those landings from the bridge of an Allied warship, and through the ingenuity of radio wire recording, the National Broadcasting Company has brought you the story as witnessed by George Hicks in a pool broadcast.
We take you now to Chicago.
Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worry on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear that pitter-pat? And that happy tune is your step. Life can be so sweet on the sunny side of the street. I used to walk in the shade with the blues on parade. But I'm not afraid. This rover crossed over. If I never had a cent, I'd be rich as Rockefeller. Gold dust at my feet on the sunny side of the street. Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worry on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear that pitter-pat? And that happy tune is your step. Life could be so sweet on the sunny side of the street. I used to walk in the shade with the blues on parade. But I'm not afraid. This rover's crossing over. If I never had a cent, I'd be rich as Rockefeller. Gold dust at my feet on the sunny side of the street.
Here is a musical salute to one of our great neighbors to the south. Roy Shield and the orchestra lend color to the brilliant samba, Brazil. Once again, it's Richard Page at the microphone with a hit song from the motion picture Higher and Higher. The music stopped.
The music stopped, but we were still dancing, which goes to show that music has charms. The lights were low, so we kept on dancing. I felt the glow of you in my arms. The band had left the stand and we were in heaven, dancing on a cloud way up in the blue. The music stopped and people were glancing, but we went on dancing, for we didn't know, because the lights were low and we were in love. In all the brilliant colors afforded by a full orchestration, Roy Shield and the orchestra paint a musical landscape of one of our great western states. Here is the Roy Shield arrangement of Nevada.
Our program closes with this rhythmic and brilliant Roy Shield treatment of an old favorite. It's Juba Dance. For the past half hour, NBC has brought you from Chicago music by Roy Shield and the orchestra, and featuring the songs of Gene McKenna and Richard Page. Stay tuned to your NBC station for all the latest news of developments on the invasion front. The National Broadcasting Company has mobilized its entire news-gathering staff in order to bring you the most comprehensive possible coverage of the world-shaking event now taking place on the continent of Europe. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
The great offensive has begun, with NBC Invasion News as right-of-way over all programs. Bulletins will be broadcast as they come through. Keep listening to WEAF.
This is Don Goddard with your news at noon, presented by Tootsie VM, the amazing new way to provide vitamins for children's deficient diets. On this D+1 day, the Sweets Company of America, makers of the product that sponsors this program, are relinquishing their regular commercial announcements in order that the maximum time of this regular news period may be devoted to bringing you the latest news on the invasion. And here it is. The German High Command is making some big claims for its troops, in which it says they say they have counterattacked in all beachhead areas of France now. The German radio says that the Nazis have smashed the major part of our invading forces. But this, manifestly, is whole-cloth propaganda designed for home front consumption. In the next breath, they admit that superior Anglo-American forces are holding firmly to their positions around Caen and Carentan. The German communique indicates that the fiercest fighting is in progress around both sides of the Orne estuary, near Caen and around Carentan, at the base of the Cherbourg Peninsula. Here is what the Nazi communique says. The Allied landing operation on the northern coast of Normandy between Le Havre and Cherbourg was supported throughout yesterday by strong naval forces. Numerous airborne formations, which were dropped in the rear of our coastal fortifications, had been intended to facilitate this landing and prevent us from bringing up our reserves. Most of them were wiped out after short, hard fighting. Well, that's what the Nazis say, and it isn't borne out by our communiques, which express a grim satisfaction in the way things are going in France. Up in the Calais area, the Germans have been claiming since early morning that new Allied landings are taking place there. But early Allied dispatches make no mention of such landings. Undoubtedly, of course, there will be other landings. This is what Hitler knows and fears. The Calais area, frequent target, would be a logical spot for such a landing. From Dover to Calais, on the northeastern coast of France, is only 21 miles. Aside from the question of landings, German long-range guns have been active in this area. They unleashed a violent barrage across the 21-mile Strait of Dover today. Explosions of the detonating shells were heard from miles around. German batteries between Boulogne and Calais, which, in a matter of moments, were subjected to a return bombardment, appeared to be in operation also. They used salvos of 6, 4, and 2 shells at a time. The Nazi firing lasted for more than an hour and a half. During this period, the coast of France was occasionally visible from the English side, and this, of course, would indicate that last night's bad weather over the Channel, some of the most unseasonable weather in years, now had lifted, and the fighting will continue. Here's an example of the contradictions which are inherent in the Nazi reports when they get to telling lies on a big scale. They say they've repelled the invasion. But a Nazi correspondent said also, just a short while later on the radio, that the glare of fires set by our planes could be seen all up and down the French coast, and that already the town of Caen, as well as numerous villages around it, had been abandoned by the Germans because those places had been set afire by Allied artillery and air bombardment. That's a great battle being fought on the Cherbourg Peninsula today between men dropped from the sky, airborne troops of both the Germans and Allied armies. We don't know much about that battle. In fact, we don't know very much about the status of the invasion this noon, except that the Americans have driven 6 to 12 miles into Normandy at some points, and Supreme Allied headquarters say the battle is going well. Berlin admits now that our beachheads extend for 50 miles along the peninsula. Also, 50 miles long was the train of gliders bearing our parachute troops, which descended like a swarm of locusts on the fields of France. Also swarming down were German parachute troops. We have a special broadcast coming up here, I've just been notified. We take you now to NBC in London for that special broadcast.
Have been cleared of the enemy. I was just given that assurance in the great map room of the Ministry of Information, where the walls are covered not only with maps of the invasion area, but also with photographic portraits of Allied leaders and even recognition pictures of enemy chieftains, such as von Rundstedt, Rommel, and Goering. The officer who gave me information about clearing of the beaches added that although all the beaches on which we have landed have been cleared of the enemy, and some of the beaches have been linked together, the fighting inland is both heavy and general. Our navies, with everything from great battle wagons down, are standing out there in the channel, banging away still at German shore batteries and other targets. Our planes, the sky is full of them, and it looks now as if the air forces may even surpass yesterday's record of 13,000 sorties. Well, that's the bright side of the picture, and no wonder the Allied communique reports satisfactory progress. That's the bright side, and bright it is. But we are being cautioned more and more here as the day known on the invasion calendar as D+1 draws toward a close. Cautioned not to give way to a hair-trigger over-optimism. NBC's George Wheeler, out in the Channel with the American Navy, reports that we're in business on the continent, and we certainly are. In business, all right, and carrying the business through. But in every business, the ledgers have two columns, one for profit and one also for cost. There will be cost in this invasion business also. There's no use blinking that fact. We would only be fooling ourselves. There are so many imponderables, so many things over which the generals and the admirals have no control. Weather, for one. It was better this morning, better than on D-Day. But then it closed in again. Latest word I have is that there are heavy clouds over much of the landing area. Returning pilots also report some icing as they flew through the upper levels of those clouds. Nor is nature our only obstacle. The Germans can by no means be discounted, merely because they have not yet mounted a major counterattack. Their resistance is increasing. Some of their coastal guns, apparently bombed out in the first phase, are barking again. Some of their planes have been in action. There is fierce fighting. In fact, the German Overseas Agency says that massed formations of operational reserves are attacking our men today with terrific ferocity in the Camp-Bayeux area on the Seine Bay. The Germans say our losses have already amounted to several divisions. That's undoubtedly an exaggeration. We hope a fantastic exaggeration. But losses there have unquestionably been, and there will be more. German air resistance is still on a small scale. But admittedly here in England, it's increasing. The Germans also say that they have thrown at least light naval forces into the fray, and they claim that we've suffered heavy naval losses. There's no reason, on the basis of what we've been told officially so far, to accept that German claim. And now, back to the NBC in New York.
That was Bill Chaplin at the NBC newsroom in London telling us about the latest from the invasion front, and that supersedes the information that we gave you in the earlier part of this program. And now let's look at some of the other fronts along the line here. While his troops of the Fifth Army were chasing disorganized German forces northward out of Rome, Lieutenant General Mark Clark issued an order of the day, an announcement of congratulations on their magnificent offensive operation, which resulted in the liberation of Rome. Said General Clark to his triumphant troops, the Germans' last-ditch defense from position to position as he retired before Rome shows conclusively that he realized how important it was for him at this time to prevent the capture of Rome, the destruction of his forces in Italy, and the accomplishment of a major Allied victory. And Clark went on to say, his failure to accomplish these missions is at once a severe blow to his prestige in this war and a loss to his armed forces which he cannot afford. Your victory augurs well for the success of other offensives, which will be hurled against the Nazis in other parts of his so-called impregnable European fortress. Yes, the Fifth and the Eighth Armies in Italy have now driven the Nazis of Kesselring in headlong flight a dozen miles north of the Eternal City. The communique says they are beating down disorganized rear guards in the path. And General Sir Harold Alexander told the Italian people this morning that he confidently believes that the strength of the German armies in central Italy has now been broken. General Alexander used that phrase in issuing a call to the patriots of Italy to arise and join in the fight against our common enemy, a call that was addressed also to the guerrillas behind the Nazi lines. An answer to the general's appeal comes by way of Barcelona today. The report from there is that 12,000 organized Italian guerrillas have moved from the Italian Piedmont along the trails used by smugglers of old into the French Savoy, the mountains where French guerrillas hide, and there have joined forces and are awaiting orders for an offensive. That may be so, it may not be so. The report comes from Spain, remember. And Yugoslav guerrillas are active today. The partisans of Tito have captured several towns in Bosnia. And over in the Pacific area, the Japanese definitely are on the winning end of the battle for that important Chinese rail city of Changsha. The latest dispatch tells how powerful Japanese columns have now closed the gap of 22 miles that the Chinese armies held and are now fighting in the suburbs of the city. The Japs will possess control of the vital railroad that runs from Hankow down to Canton if they take Changsha in this, their fourth attempt. And down in China's Yunnan province, the Chinese armies take the honors. They've driven the Japs from several strong points now. And the Japs also apparently have given up their battle for Kohima under the competent persuasion of British and Indian troops there in India. And they are now withdrawing. In fact, they seem to have withdrawn about 6 miles, according to the latest dispatch. And on Biak Island, our troops nearest the Philippines are still inching toward the Jap airfield and running into murderous Jap resistance. And American planes in the Central Pacific continue their systematic bombing of Truk and Nauru and bases in the Marshall Islands. And back home, well, you just can't put these things in terms of money, but there has to be monetary support to launch and sustain great battles, and the biggest battle of all, our invasion of Western Europe, will cost most money of all. Acting on testimony from the military experts on just how much money, the House Appropriations Committee this morning voted close to $50 billion in support of our fighting forces and their campaigns for the year ending July 1st. The biggest appropriation bill for the war now goes to the House. There is little doubt about its passage, especially in the glare of the battles now being waged. The appropriation will bring to a total of $390 billion the obligations that Congress will have voted for the war since July 1st, 1940. And some of the most interesting testimony, by the way, now outdated, of course, by the great events of the past few hours, was that of General Harold Alexander, or General H.H. Arnold, our air commander. In the first 4 months of 1944, said General Hap Arnold, we had flown some 218,000 sorties against Germany and had dropped 175,000 tons of bombs during that same time. And during that same time, we were able to fly more than a third as many against the Japanese targets over much longer distances and drop a fourth as many bombs. During that period, we destroyed 5,700 German planes and 1,400 Japanese planes. And the Nazi enslaved people of Europe heard the word today that they've been waiting 4 years to hear from the lips of Herbert H. Lehman, director of the United States Rehabilitation Administration. They heard that relief is on the way. They are assured a new life, a life of freedom and regeneration will soon be theirs, even as the tidal waves of armed retribution consigns the tyrants to a history's hall of fame. Lehman said in the shortwave broadcast, plans have been laid for giving you a life along the road to a secure new life. And now an announcement. Don't forget, friends, when you shop this weekend, get new Tootsie VM, the amazing new kind of milk fortifier that provides vitamins for children's deficient diets in the way they love. Just stir 2 teaspoonfuls of Tootsie VM in a tall glass of milk and serve your children a frosty, cool, thirst-quenching party drink they can't resist. It tastes like their favorite candy, chocolatey Tootsie Rolls. And besides giving them plenty of healthful milk, Tootsie VM provides 8 extra vitamins and minerals. See what wonders it may work. And remember, the only way to make milk taste like Tootsie Rolls is to get Tootsie VM. No ration points. The weather forecast for New York City and 50 miles around. This afternoon, partly cloudy and moderately warm. Tonight, cloudy and cooler. Tomorrow, clear to partly cloudy with a high of between 75 and 80 degrees. The temperature in New York at the moment is 69 degrees. The humidity is 46%. And a brief summary of the top news for the benefit of those who may have tuned in late. A great battle between airborne troops, both German and Allied, is raging in Cherbourg Peninsula now, and the entire coast is ablaze with great fires. We are still holding our own there. And that's your news at noon, brought to you by Tootsie VM, that provides vitamins for children's deficient diets in the way they love. And this is Don Goddard saying, I'll see you tomorrow.
Don Goddard broadcast from the NBC newsroom in New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Midnight Eastern Wartime, WEAF, New York. Good evening, everybody. This is Lyle Van reporting from the NBC newsroom in New York. The first 24 hours of invasion, history-making hours, have about run their course. It was 12:30 o'clock yesterday morning, Eastern Wartime, that the first Americans set foot on the rocky coast of France, followed 1 hour later by Canadian and British troops. Since then, amphibious and parachute troops have consolidated beachheads and positions along a 60-mile strip of coast between Le Havre and Cherbourg, have penetrated several miles inland from the sea in some places. The invasion is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner. A Navy man just back from the invasion coast says all main points have been gained. There's an air of unmistakable optimism at General Eisenhower's headquarters, wrinkled only by one factor, the threat of bad weather over the Channel tonight. Reinforcements are being rushed to the Norman coast to strengthen the troops landed there already. But the Channel is being whipped by a rising wind. The barometer is falling. It was bad weather that prevented the invasion thrust from starting 1 day sooner than it did. And now the unpredictable Channel weatherman is acting up again. Satisfactory progress for our invasion forces is relayed from both German and Allied quarters. London says our invasion troops are making headway against opposition much weaker than expected. Allied casualties are much lighter than expected. President Roosevelt spoke to the nation by radio an hour or so ago, requested the people of America to join him in a prayer that the Allies may prevail over the enemy, that they may build a sure peace. He prefaced his prayer with the remark that our assault of liberation has met with success to this hour. Earlier in the day, at a news conference, the chief made reference to our naval losses, disclosed that 2 destroyers and 1 landing craft were the Allied naval losses to the first hours of invasion. 3 craft lost out of a total of more than 4,000 taking part. The German High Command says fighting in the Cherbourg-Le Havre area is in full swing, that the Anglo-Americans are putting up a most tenacious resistance. Vichy Radio, which is German-controlled, admits the Allied beachhead area has been considerably widened and Allied reinforcements are pouring in. A dispatch from London states a great force of RAF bombers left an East Coast airdrome in England tonight are streaming southward in one solid procession. More than 1,000 troop-carrying gliders took part in the early stages of the invasion. More Allied troops were dropped from planes by parachute. Overall, 11,000 planes of all descriptions took part in the greatest aerial operation the world has ever seen. There are indications tonight that the Germans are losing touch with some of their battle groups, that they're not sure where the main force of the Allied assault will strike. One German broadcast from Berlin, one for home consumption, said, "We do not want to report now on the hard fighting going on all over Normandy. We're fighting a tough enemy. It's not an easy job." The British Ministry of Supplies says military power of the greatest magnitude is being employed by the Allies, including many secret weapons never before used. But by the time the sun was setting this evening, the Germans had not yet used their secret rocket guns, the ones that were supposed to have devastated southeast England. And the Germans say they expect new Allied landings along the coast of France, northward in the area of Boulogne and Calais. But the bad weather over the Channel augurs against such a move at this time. This vast military venture, far too big to picture at one glance, was made up of many component parts, hundreds of specialists and their machines of war doing their specific job, the sum total adding up to success in the first 24 hours of operations. Take the minesweepers, for example. They swept in first in the dark hours yesterday morning. Their job was to clear a path for the mighty fleet that was to follow. Converted fishing trawlers, coal burners, that served in the First World War, ships still on the secret list. These were the fleet of little boats that paved the way. They used sweep wires to tear loose the mines that barred the way to the French coast. There's no report of any of these gallant little craft being lost at this hour. They performed their tasks silently and efficiently. Behind them came the great battle wagons and their supporting warships. Each had their appointed task, an appointed target along that invasion strip. The gunners were assigned the most precise task, that of keeping their aim straight and true. 6 of Britain's battleships defied German coastal guns, sailed in close to wham salvos into German shore positions. At least 3 American battle wagons, the Nevada, the Texas, and the Arkansas, perhaps more, were there on the job too. The aim of these Allied gunners was very accurate indeed. Coast guns silenced before they had time to inflict any damage worth mentioning on the Allied fleet. British warships alone poured 2,000 tons of shells into the French coast every 10 minutes. 600 warships banging away at one time. What a great noise that must have been. And behind this cannonade came another group of specialists, the invasion craft themselves. This snub-nosed fleet was equipped with its own firepower, came in shooting in the wake of the job done by the Navy. The men who manned those invasion boats had a job to do, and they did it well. And the fighting men who took the rough ride across the Channel to land on the beaches, while the words of General Eisenhower's communique speaks eloquently enough of the job they've done. But let's pause a minute and consider the task assigned to our paratroopers. They were the first to hit the invasion coast. They flew over the hazards at sea, the hazards on the beaches, the hazards behind the beaches. They dropped down right in the middle of a hard-bitten, determined enemy, perhaps the most dangerous undertaking of all. There's been no detailed account of their fighting behind the front. They're battling in the region of Caen, 10 miles inland from the sea, and that point of resistance must be manned by our parachute troops tonight. Our amphibious forces haven't had time to drive that deep in from the landing beaches. Thousands upon thousands of paratroopers, both British and American, were dropped behind the Atlantic Wall. The spokesman at headquarters in London says he's not in a position to give out a detailed report of what has happened since they dropped from the sky. But they're armed with knives and Tommy guns, assigned to blow bridges, disrupt enemy transport lines, cause as much confusion as they can where it'll do the most good. Before taking off on their flight across the Channel, they were wished Godspeed by the boss himself, General Ike Eisenhower, who spent 7 hours touring aerodromes from which the air troops were to take off. And after chatting with the last of them, the boss climbed to a roof, watched the aerial procession as squadron after squadron flew off to the east. We know there was very little mishap to that paratroop armada while in the air. The big Dakota transport planes flew with running lights to keep formation, but met almost no opposition from the once-vaunted Luftwaffe. And perhaps one of the most colorful parts of the invasion is the story of the truly American Indians that took part. Indian parachute troops, composed of Yaqui and Cherokee tribesmen, shaved their heads down to a scalp lock, just as their forebears did in previous wars. The Indians were trained in demolition, carried 180 pounds of equipment on their backs, went into battle with red and black war paint on their faces. Included, too, in the paratroop division were a Hindu high diver, many daredevil automobile divers, former college athletes. Brave men all, these paratroopers, and they're fighting somewhere ahead of the front lines on the French invasion coast tonight. It's only fair to speak of the airmen last. Not that our pilots and bombardiers have not done a daring and superb job, but because they've been in the news spotlight for many months now, doing the same kind of job they did last night and today. The thoroughness of their work can be read in the report tonight that enemy opposition is lighter than expected, that Allied casualties are lighter than expected, that the invasion operation is proceeding according to plan. And as Prime Minister Winston Churchill terms it, what a plan. They laid a carpet of bombs along the selected landing spots, combined with our naval gunners to dynamite a path through enemy fortifications. Our airmen flew in bad weather, rain, and poor visibility that the Luftwaffe dared not risk. All told, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 Allied planes took to the air, opposed by a mere 50 German planes. Almost 200 Allied planes to one German aircraft. Radio Berlin, monitored by NBC, gives this lame excuse for the Luftwaffe failing to come up and fight. Poor visibility. But it didn't keep our planes aground. There's little doubt, though, that Reich Marshal Hermann Goering will send his Luftwaffe against our invasion forces. He put himself on record with this statement today. The invasion must be crushed, even if it means the annihilation of the German Air Force. And we hope it does mean that. We have eyewitness reports, first-hand accounts of war reporters who went in with the troops. Ed Hawker of NBC flew over the invasion area in a reconnaissance plane, reported no German planes anywhere in sight. Howard Marshall of BBC went ashore with the first assault troops. He rode in one of the invasion craft, came back to London in clothes dripping from seawater. Here's his story. Our barge ran into a maze of anti-invasion spikes driven in the shallow water just out from the beaches. Spikes driven into the bottom with mines attached to the top. We hit one of them. The mine exploded with a great noise. A hole was blown in the bottom of our barge. But the men let down the ramp, and a Bren gun carrier drove out, fell into 5 feet of water. The men kept going toward the beaches. A second division of assault troops followed the one I was with. Soon the waves of troops had disappeared up over the beach. More followed in their wake, and the beachhead was established. There are many other eyewitness accounts, all giving pretty much the same picture. Beachheads nailed down with speed and dispatch. Beachmasters taking control in a jiffy, assigning weapons and supplies to assault units. The invasion rolling forward with very few hitches. The American troops who boarded their invasion craft in England last night seemed unaware that they were standing at the crossroads of history, that they were to help make that history. They jumped aboard with shaved heads, with $4 in invasion money, and right away there were poker and crap games in progress, even while they were waiting to pull out for the big task. One American staff sergeant had hundreds of dollars worth of invasion currency, and he passed it off with this remark: "I like to travel heavy. There's lots of stuff I want to buy when I get over there." There's still a vast hidden army, waiting and ready to swing into action, the French underground. General de Gaulle has made a stirring appeal to that underground army of France, exhorted them to fight with all the means at their disposal to destroy the Germans. At this hour, that hidden fighting force is still waiting, instructed by General Eisenhower to hold its fire until the appointed signal is given. The Germans are well aware of this unseen menace. They've launched a campaign of threats promising dire penalty if any Frenchman is caught in the act of sabotage. But the people of France will be ready when the proper time is at hand. A glance at other war fronts, almost buried by the avalanche of reports from invasion headquarters. American planes took off from bases in Soviet Russia today, bombed German aerodromes at Galati in Romania. Then they flew back to their Russian bases, the first American raid of the war from bases in Russian territory. Official Moscow reports the German offensive in Romania slackening after more than a week of attacks. And there are semi-official rumors in the Soviet capital that the grand summer offensive may soon be launched in the east to coincide with the Allied jump across the channel. In Yugoslavia, Marshal Tito says he's launched a new offensive, captured 6 towns in that Balkan nation. Down in the South Pacific, mopping up operations continue on Biak Island. But in Southeast Asia, American bombers smashed Bangkok, the capital of Thailand, with its heaviest blow of the war. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, warns all police and other law enforcement bodies to be on the alert, to watch for any sign of sabotage now that the invasion is underway. Solemn ceremonies were in order at West Point today, graduation exercises for cadets of our military academy. And those ceremonies were interrupted by a thunderous round of applause as Cadet John Eisenhower stepped to the platform to receive his diploma. The son of the Allied invasion commander was commissioned as second lieutenant in the infantry, assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, for advanced training. In a late dispatch from London, in the first news dispatch sent from the soil of France, Canadian press war correspondent Ross Monroe says that in 2 hours and 45 minutes of fighting, the Canadian invasion force had won its beachhead and shoved on inland. Monroe quotes the message the Canadian commander sent to Lieutenant General Creeder. Beachhead taken, well on way to immediate objective. And here are some late bulletins picked up from the British radio by our monitors here in the NBC newsroom. The first German prisoners taken in the invasion operations have been landed in British ports. RAF pilots returning from low-level flights over the beachheads say the Allied forces appear to be doing very well, that there's no longer any sign of enemy opposition on the beaches. The Allies have already put up barrage balloons over captured sections of the French coast. Here at home, the nation marked the invasion report with silent prayer, the praying perhaps most noticeable in the nation's so-called gay spots. In New York City, war workers, shop workers, bankers, all turned their thoughts to God in the great crisis. Mayor LaGuardia calls city employees and officials into his office at noon for a special service. The New York Stock Exchange halted activity for 2 minutes to beseech divine help for our invasion troops. Many thousands of New York shop girls were sent home after working a half day with instruction to pray and hope for victory. The nation's racetracks call off their programs in observance of the day. In all corners of the nation, all persons, and that means everyone who has a friend or relative in the great adventure, all paused and prayed consciously or unconsciously for its success. And at a port in South England late today, a minesweeper eased up to a dock just back from the invasion coast. No one cheered. There was a call for the medical corps. That minesweeper was bringing the first American wounded, the first American dead, back from the battle area. It's a reminder that the invasion, while being the greatest event of the war, is also a grim and deadly business. And the full deadliness will not be known until the great battles of the future are fought along the road to Berlin. This is Lyle Van saying good night from the NBC newsroom in New York City. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
NBC is standing by to bring you the complete news coverage of the invasion. Any and all programs will be interrupted for bulletins as they come through. Stay tuned to WEIF New York.
Following its procedure of Invasion Day coverage, NBC will interrupt this program to bring you the latest news developments as they are received from overseas. From Chicago, we bring you Roy Shield and the orchestra. The opening number on the program this evening, My Ideal.
The velvet voice of Jean McKenna is heard now in a mood of intermittent sentimentality as she tells you, sometimes I'm happy.
Sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm blue. My disposition depends on you. I never mind the rain from the skies if I can find the sun in your eyes. Sometimes I love you, sometimes I hate you, but when I hate you, it's 'cause I love you. That's how I am, and what can I do? I'm happy when I'm with you. Sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm blue. My disposition depends on you. I never mind the rain from the sky if I can find the sun in your eyes. Sometimes I love you, sometimes I hate you, but when I hate you, that's because I love you. That's how I am, so what can I do? I'm happy when I'm with you. That's how I am, so what can I do? I'm happy when I'm with you.
Roy Shield and the orchestra take you on a rhythmic treasure hunt in three-quarter time that has, as a reward, the shining melodies of the Gold and Silver Waltz.
Ladies and gentlemen, the National Broadcasting Company is interrupting all its programs to bring you the latest news as it is received on the invasion story. The German news agency Transocean has just reported that the Allies have made further landings at the mouth of the Orne River under cover of naval artillery. The agency says heavy fighting is raging on the coast of northern France. We return you now to the program in progress.
The blazing sun of skies below the border throws everything in brilliant contrast, including the music loved by our good neighbors to the south. Sometimes it's the snap of the rumba, sometimes the soft sorrow of La Paloma. In time with the speed of today's movements, we bring you España Cañí. We pause briefly for station identification.
WEAF, New York.
You are listening to the music of Roy Shield and the orchestra, presenting a program of tunes that you love. And here is a soft melody, Brightly Shines the Moon. Ziegfeld Follies of fond memory brought us many stage spectacles and many hit tunes. But none of them more clearly earmarks these grand productions than the tune that glorifies the American girl. A pretty girl is like a melody. A tune whose tempo is set to the rhythm of American thoughts tonight. Roy Shield and the orchestra bring you the stirring march cadence from Suite Algérienne. Roy Shield flips his baton in a musical tribute to a good neighbor, whose capital has also given us a great tune, Montevideo. conclusion, from Roy Shield and the orchestra, a wish that you rest softly and sweetly all through the night. From Chicago, the National Broadcasting Company has brought you the music of Roy Shield and the orchestra with vocalist Gene McKenna. A program of lovely melodies for your listening pleasure. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
The long-awaited invasion was underway. It was not until 7:30, when the 8 o'clock starters began to hurry along, that an undercurrent of excitement was evident. By that time, people on the streets were talking animatedly. The atmosphere changed. Under its bright June sun, Washington in general at last became aware that the big day had arrived. I return you now to New York.
You have just heard Albert Leach reporting from CBS Washington. For further news on the European invasion, keep tuned to your Columbia station. This is CBS. Portia Faces Life, presented by the makers of Grape Nuts, and Joyce Jordan, presented by the makers of La France and Satina, will not be heard today.
From Columbia's World News headquarters in New York, we bring you Quincy Howe with news and an analysis of the invasion.
Here's some late bulletins that have just recently come in to CBS World News headquarters here in New York. Allied invasion armies landed in northwestern France today, drove at least 9.5 miles into the Nazi West Wall to the town of Caen, that's C-A-E-N, and after 12 hours of fighting, held beachheads on a broad front along the coast of Normandy. This dispatch comes from Supreme Allied headquarters in London. Prime Minister Winston Churchill told Commons late today that the invasion is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner, and simultaneously, a Supreme Headquarters announcement, a headquarters spokesman, said the American and Allied armies have gotten over the first 5 or 6 hurdles in the greatest amphibious assault of all time. The German Transocean News Agency, however, broadcast a statement by a Nazi military spokesman which said that except for the Caen beachhead, all the invasion troops had been thrown back toward the sea. The spokesman, this is a German, claimed that the Allied beachhead is only 9 to 12 miles wide and about a mile deep, whereas the Allied invasion headquarters speak of its being 9.5 miles deep. Churchill, making his second appearance of the day in the House of Commons to report on the invasion, said in announcing satisfactory developments, the troops have penetrated in some cases several miles inland. Lodgements exist on a broad front. He said Allied forces were fighting inside Caen, 9.5 miles inland and some 30 miles southwest of Le Havre. Earlier Berlin broadcasts reported fighting on both sides of the town, as well as Allied landings all around a broad reach, of the Norman coast from the tip of the Cherbourg Peninsula to the Seine estuary. Many dangers and difficulties, which at this time last night appeared extremely formidable, are behind us, Churchill said. The passage of the sea has been made with far less loss than we apprehended. And then here's a late bulletin that comes from London saying that the German-controlled Vichy radio said that violent fighting was taking place on the islands of Guernsey and Jersey west of the Norman Peninsula. The German radio had already announced something about Allied parachute landings on these islands. Well, today's landings in Western Europe have taken the minds of a good many of us off the Japanese. You may be sure the Japanese are not returning the compliment, for the Japanese see 2 dangers to themselves as a result of this final all-out attack on Germany. First, they can begin to see the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. Indeed, the Japanese, through their connections with the Germans, ought to have more first-hand information than has come our way about Germany's real strength and real weakness. The Japanese also know that the Anglo-American powers have been giving priority to the war against Germany. The war against Japan we've only just begun to fight, and once the Anglo-American powers are free to bear down exclusively on Japan, we may start to see the beginning of the end of that war, too. The Japanese can therefore be counted on to do their utmost this summer to knock China out of the war, hence their present big offensive, or series of offensives, in southeast China. Japan's one hope is to knock China out of the war before we have knocked out Germany. And today's news from Europe means that the Japs must finish this year, a job at which they've labored in vain ever since they attacked Manchuria way back in 1931. And that job is the destruction of the power and the unity of China. The prospect of a German defeat, perhaps this year, is not Japan's only worry in connection with the liberation of Europe. The Japanese also have reason to fear the closer relations between the Anglo-American powers and Russia that are certain to result from successful joint action against Germany. Until we'd actually committed ourselves to sending large armies to liberate Western Europe, the Japanese could still hope that Anglo-Americans and the Russians might disagree. The Japanese set great store by their neutrality pact with the Russians. They would ask for nothing better than to have that neutrality pact continue to the end of time. As for the Russians, they've had their hands full with the Germans. They could not afford to do more than tie up some Japanese troops by massing some of their own troops on the Manchurian border. If the Russians had gone to war against Japan, they might have lost Moscow, Stalingrad, and Leningrad to the Germans. And, we might as well admit it, the Russians have not always believed that the Anglo-American powers had it in them to open the second front in the West that started today. But now that we've opened a new front in Western Europe, the Russians have far greater confidence, not only in our determination to smash the Germans, but in our ability to wage war. The Russians know we've made headway against the Japanese, while we have at the same time prepared for the far greater attack against Germany. From the point of view of self-interest alone, the Russians therefore have every reason to want to play along with Britain and America, not only in the liberation of Europe, but in creating stability in Asia. It's much too early to say how much the Russians will be willing and able to do in the war against Japan. But it's not too early to see what today's events in Western Europe spell out to the Japanese in Eastern Asia. The Anglo-American powers have demonstrated overwhelming power in 2 major wars and in 3 elements: land, sea, and air. The Anglo-Americans have also learned how to work and fight in cooperation with the Russians in Western Europe. The Japanese are not so blind to their own welfare and self-interest as to be unable to draw conclusions. It's therefore just as well for us to take a few minutes out today and remember that the landings in Western Europe have also hastened the defeat of Japan. And next, you'll hear from Bill Shirer of CBS World News, who has seen Germany's West Wall and the invasion coast of France, where the attacks are coming today. Mr. Shirer.
You all undoubtedly have heard a great deal, especially in the last few weeks, about the so-called Atlantic Wall, which the Germans have erected to stop our invasion. And in the next few days, we're going to test to see whether that Atlantic Wall is as strong as German propaganda has made it out to be. As a matter of fact, while the Germans have erected strong defenses here and there along the long coastline in Western Europe, the truth is that the ballyhoo about the Atlantic Wall has been largely a product of German propaganda. Mr. Churchill, in his first address to the Commons today, spoke of the underwater barriers being overcome easier than had been expected. 3 years ago, up on that Channel coast, I had a look at some of those barriers. They consisted mostly of steel contraptions put in 2 lines for the tides, one out 200 or 300 yards from shore and one maybe within 50 yards of shore, and which were designed to stop landing boats from coming up on the beach. The way to get at those, of course, is by torpedoes and exploding your own mines. And so far, as we can see, our troops do not seem to have had a great deal of difficulty in overcoming these underwater barriers. Now, there have been pictures in our papers, which have come from German sources, showing great underground forts along the coast of France. And while undoubtedly some of those do exist, I saw some of them 3 years ago or so, they have been greatly over-exaggerated, and there are not a large number of these underground forts. I was interested yesterday in hearing a broadcast from the leading German military commentator, Lieutenant General Dittmar, who serves as a spokesman for the German General Staff. Now, probably he knew within the last 2 or 3 days that invasion was imminent, and he went on the air a day or two ago in Berlin to more or less warn his own people that the term Fortress Europe, or as the Germans say, Festung Europa, was not such a great thing as Dr. Goebbels had led them to believe. He said, for example, I've noted down some notes from his broadcast, I have always refrained, he said, from use of the term Festung Europa, or the Fortress Europe, as much as possible, because, as German general explains, it might give rise to rather misleading conceptions which could not do justice to the special conditions and standards of this war. It suggests, he says, too much the idea of narrowness and isolation. And he goes on to say that if one speaks of the Fortress of Europe, this can be applied only in a figurative sense. In other words, what seems plain, and I think what we will see in the next few days and weeks in the fighting in northwestern Europe, is that there has been no such thing as a great European fortress, and no such thing as a great Atlantic Wall, but merely groups of German fortifications, largely made up of mines and so-called strong points, which the German called Schwerpunkt, along strategic highways and ridges, which they will use in trying to stop our troops. I always think when we hear this propaganda, and undoubtedly you'll hear a great deal if the German propaganda gets to you in the next few days about the Atlantic Wall, that the Germans themselves have never believed in the idea of a chain of forts, a fortified line such as the Maginot Line, stopping a good army. When I went through Poland with the German army, and later when I went through the Western Campaign just 4 years ago this very month, the German officers, their generals, the high command, were confident that no fortifications which men could erect in our time could stop them. And I've always had the idea that now, when it's our turn to attack, the Germans were never confident that they could stop us with fortifications. So much for the talk about the Atlantic Wall. The only way the Germans will halt us or slow us up is through their armies fighting in the field.
And now we bring you once more Quincy Howe.
Here are some more news bulletins that have come in during the past few minutes. The Transocean News Agency of Berlin, in a broadcast today, said that the Allies had established a 15-mile front from a mile to half a mile deep between Villers-sur-Mer and Trouville. This area is about 7 miles south of the big port of Le Havre, where a transatlantic liner docked in the pre-war days, and it takes in the beach resort area of Deauville. And from London, the Allied air activity, already at a record peak, reached new heights this evening when swarms of fighters and bombers roared overhead toward the continent, wrapping the London area in an unending drone of powerful motors. And more details on this: the 10,000 tons of bombs cleared the way for the Allied army which invaded Europe today. And as the attacking planes swept through the French sky, only 50 German planes rose to oppose them. Allied aircraft ruled the skies not only over the invasion beaches, but also far inland. The first official reports of the greatest aerial operation of the war said that the Allies made 7,500 sorties between midnight and 8 a.m. In Parliament, Prime Minister Churchill said that an armada of 11,000 first-line planes sustained the assault. The 7,500 sorties between midnight and 8 a.m. did not take into account the hail of bombs, rockets, and bullets that crashed down upon the French coast in the hours following. During the period covered by the report, more than 1,000 British heavy bombers filled the night with thunder, and at dawn the American 8th Air Force sent more than 1,000 of our heavies into the air.
You've heard news and analyses of the invasion by William L. Shirer and Quincy Howe. For complete coverage of the invasion, keep tuned to your Columbia station. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. Young Dr. Malone, presented by the makers of Post Toasties, will not be heard today. Until further bulletins on the invasion are received, we'll present a program of unannounced music. CBS World News, which is bringing you the latest information from the French invasion beaches, will interrupt this program immediately to broadcast any news or special programs from abroad. We now rejoin the special music program. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. The Adventures of Perry Mason, presented by the makers of Camay Soap, will not be heard today. Instead, we bring you more news of the invasion of Western Europe. One of the latest reports comes from the British radio, which said that the invasion line is now sufficiently broad to be considered more than a bridgehead. And now for the news direct from overseas, we take you to London. Merrill Miller reporting.
Hello, NBC, American broadcasters. I'm switching to you in about 20 seconds. Here it comes. Stand by. This is London at 8:45 p.m. In a moment, we hope to establish contact with the American radio reporter, Merrill Muller, covering General Eisenhower's headquarters, somewhere in England. Go ahead, Merrill Muller.
This is Robert Barr speaking from Advanced Allied Command Post on the 6th of June. This is
London again. There's been a slight delay in getting the broadcast just announced. One moment, please.
By Duncan.
One moment, please. At this time, we are attempting to establish contact with the American radio reporter, Merrill Muller, covering General Eisenhower's headquarters. One moment, please. In a few moments, we hope to establish contact with our reporter with General Eisenhower's headquarters. In the meantime, will the American networks start programming from New York and await a call from London?
We bring you now the latest dispatches on the invasion. The German Transocean News Agency said tonight that the Allied offensive area has been extended to the entire Norman Peninsula. 9th Air Force Troop Carrier Base, England. American Indians in full war paint, dropping silently from the skies to strike with the deadly stealth of their ancestors, were among the first paratroop units to go into action. They were members of an engineers' demolition unit, the Braves. They wore red and black war paint and had their heads shaved except for scalp locks. In training, they had taken the name the Filthy 13. Except for their heads, they were a far cry from their ancestors. Each carried enough equipment to sustain himself in the field until his mission was accomplished and to care for wounds. One staff sergeant, a full-blooded Yaqui, carried 180 pounds packed on his 183-pound frame. Other members of the Filthy 13 were Yaquis and Cherokees. They were part of the greatest airborne operation in history, which apparently caught German defenses by surprise. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the man who set H hour and D-Day. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill approved the battle plans at Quebec in August 1943, but selecting the exact time was left to the Supreme Commander. This was stated today in a 37-page unofficial invasion summary written by British officers and released by the War Office. The summary revealed that Roosevelt and Churchill agreed at Casablanca early in 1943 to knock Italy out of the war before invading France, even though they knew this would delay the Western assault until 1944. We've been trying to establish contact with Merrill Muller, radio reporter at Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters in London. However, in London, it was impossible at the moment to establish contact with Mr. Muller. Until further bulletins on the invasion are received, we'll present a program of unannounced music. take you now to London, Merrill Muller reporting. We regret that we're unable again to contact Merrill Muller. Until such time as we can, we continue our program of music. Of Great Britain. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The future of the world hangs on the outcome of the final struggle between the Allies and Nazi Germany. NBC will provide complete news coverage of the invasion. Stay tuned to WEAF, New York.
Good morning. This is Robert St. John bringing you up to date with the invasion news. Since I talked to you a little more than 1 hour ago, we've obtained some details about what happened on the French beaches when the Allied invasion struck. One dispatch says there were few Nazi survivors along the shore after the punishing sea and air bombardment. The ground troops which went ashore found the few Germans they encountered so dazed that they were quickly killed or captured. That is one reason why our casualties have thus far been so slight. Axis radios have listed 15 places at which Allied landings were made. There's no sense reading the names of all the towns and villages mentioned by the enemy, because most of them are small French settlements which few of us have ever heard of. But one thing seems certain, as the second day of the invasion is about to start. It's dawn over there now, you know. As the invaders watch the sun come up over France, for a second time, we hold a strip of France about 100 miles long and as much as 15 miles deep at several points. There's a report that we've cut the one railroad which leads from the heart of France down into the Cherbourg Peninsula. If that is true, the Nazis will be hard put to it to supply their troops defending that finger of land called Normandy. That finger of land which sticks out into the English Channel and comes just 80 miles from touching that island called Britain. If and when we occupy all of the Normandy Peninsula, we will be well on our way to our first major objective in Western Europe, the French capital of Paris. It was a great day when American and British troops marched into Rome. It will be a greater day when Paris is liberated from the Nazis. And now here's an interesting report, the report of an RAF flyer just back from swooping low over the beaches. He says that the beaches are all in our hands, and as proof, he cites the fact that all of the Allied soldiers he saw were moving ahead, standing up. Well, they wouldn't be doing that if there was very much enemy opposition. The best story we've received since I last talked to you is one written over in France on a portable typewriter by a real frontline correspondent who's a good friend of mine, Ross Monroe, a Canadian attached to the Canadian forces now in France. The Canadian units, and I'm sure they included some of the survivors of Dieppe, were given a certain spot on the French coastline which they were to take. Well, war correspondent Ross Monroe, who went ashore with the Canadian boys, now reports that they took their beachhead in exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes of fighting at the edge of the water, and then they started moving inland. Their commander flashed back a message, beachhead taken, well on way to immediate objective. Even the Canadian boys who were not on that ill-fated Dieppe operation were eager to get some revenge for what the Nazis did to their countrymen that time. War correspondent Monroe says the strip of beach the Canadians did liberate is not very long, and yet it will provide a good landing place, a good base where men and supplies can now be dumped. And then he goes on to tell us something no other correspondent has mentioned. He says there's been some stiff fighting, some street fighting, in little French coastal towns today. About what happened down on the beaches, the Canadian reporter tells us that the Nazis had planted numerous steel and wooden obstacles in the shallow water. He doesn't describe just what they were. I imagine censorship prevented that. Anyway, these obstacles had been placed so that when the tide was high, they couldn't be seen. And yet they were a menace, and a very serious menace to the invaders. Fortunately, however, the invasion barges reached this spot before high tide, and so Canadian engineers quickly cleared the water of the strange obstacles, the secret weapons of the Nazis. The Canadians, as they swarmed ashore, were met by considerable machine gun and mortar and artillery fire, but by 10 a.m., they were a full 1,000 yards from the water and going ahead strong, meeting only scattered pockets of Germans. Ross Monroe tells us that Canadian and British airborne troops did a grand job. Some of those who landed by glider immediately seized and held some very important bridges, thus preventing the Nazis from destroying them. Monroe had words of high praise for the men out in the ships, those ships which laid down the withering barrage which enabled the ground troops to get ashore with so few casualties. He tells how one cruiser knocked out a battery, a Nazi battery, of course, about 1.5 miles inland, a battery which was giving the Canadians plenty of trouble. The cruiser's guns fired just 6 shots. The last one knocked the Nazi guns out of action, and the Canadians were able to forge ahead. Monroe gives us a graphic description of what it looks like over there now. He says the entire coast of France, as far as you can see, is wreathed in heavy smoke, smoke from thousands of bombs and shells, and also from rifle fire. He tells how destroyers and cruisers are prowling up and down the channel, eager to finish off anything that may show up. You've heard that expression, an air umbrella. It's trite, it's a hackneyed expression, but I don't know of any other to describe the protection which British and American planes have been giving our ships and our men these past 24 hours. It is an umbrella. All day yesterday and all night tonight, Spitfires and Lightnings have come sweeping in. They've taken up hovering positions over the ships and over the men on the beaches. They stay there until more Allied planes come to relieve them. And so the men on the ships and the men on the ground don't have much worrying to do about death from the sky. The Canadian correspondent also tells us that the night is made bright in some spots by burning buildings, buildings which have come within the range of naval guns or the bombs of our planes. Now let's see if we don't have a couple of last-minute bulletins for you. Here's one. Prime Minister Churchill has just promised in Commons that he will make a new statement today on overnight developments in the Allied invasion of France. And here's another one. The German news agency Transocean says that the Allies have made further landings at the mouth of the Orne River under cover of naval artillery. Well, that's the invasion news up to 1 a.m. on the morning of June the 7th. And this is Robert St. John going off to bed with a good night to you.
Thank you, and good night to you, Mr. St. John. This is the National Broadcasting Company.